Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight in the middle of summer. My name is John Tabor. I'm a city councilor, and with Assistant Mayor Joanna Kelly, we are the co-chairs of the Housing Committee. We look forward to tonight's presentation from RKG Associates. Based on our work in 2023 and 24, repurposing city property for housing, changing a lot of acres of our city from commercial to mixed use and residential, we received a housing opportunity grant from the state of New Hampshire. And we've used that to fund a study by RKG. And that study is going to look at, now that we've opened up more areas for residential zoning, how we can best create incentives and further modify our zoning to remove barriers to housing growth and housing formation. So that's been the task of RKG. They're here to present their preliminary work and to get input for further work. So we look forward to the Q&A part as well. And Peter, did you have anything to add? Okay, great.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Councilor Tabor. Really appreciate it. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kyle Tlunty. I'm the president of RKG Associates. As you've been told, the reason why we're here tonight is we were specifically asked to look at the city's existing workforce housing policy and identify, one, does it work? Does it accomplish what we're hoping it would accomplish? And if the answer is no, then what are some of the things that we can do to modify it, to make it more effective, to address the goals that it's intended to achieve, which is to provide more price diversity in new residential development here in the city. Thank you, Jason. As a disclaimer to everybody here and on the internet, I'm not going to be reading every word on every slide. This is going to be made available to everybody and anybody, so don't worry if I'm not going verbatim by what's on the screen. But I just want to let you all know that this information all will be available to everybody by the end of it. But really what this is talking about is what I just mentioned, which is we took a look at the feasibility of your existing workforce housing policy, and we ran a financial model to understand whether or not the current policy creates the financial incentives necessary to encourage developers to take advantage of it. And one of the big challenges, not just here in Portsmouth, but through all of New Hampshire, that communities face when they're trying to do workforce housing policies like these, is that you are not allowed to make these policies compulsory. They're voluntary. And so one of the challenges you will have to face that many communities, like we do a substantial amount of work on inclusionary zoning, if you're familiar with the term, in Massachusetts, but one of the biggest differences in there, they're allowed to make the policies required so that you're not able to opt out of them. And that's an important distinction for you to all to understand as we go through this, because we're going to kind of show you the results of the analysis and trying to explain to you why, and not to jump the shark here, but why the policy doesn't currently work and what are the things that we can do to try and make it work within that paradigm of we have to create an incentive for the development community to take advantage of it. Next, please, Jason. So there's a lot of components that went into it. I'm not going to teach a master's class on financial feasibility modeling tonight, but rest assured, when you look at the feasibility of a real estate project, there are some very important key components you have to understand. The three main ones are construction, so how much does it cost to acquire the land and build the project? Operation, how much is going to cost to run the project, because once I build it, I have to maintain it, operate it if it's a rental project, and then I sell it if it's an ownership project. And then what are the revenues that I'm going to collect as a builder developer? What are my rents if it's an apartment complex? What are my sale prices if it's an ownership project? And so all those components go into determining how well the project performs financially. There are metrics, as you look on the right side of the screen here, called rates of return, that are industry standards for developers when they're looking at whether or not a project is worth pursuing based on the financial reward they're going to get for the risk that they're going to take in the investment that they're going to make in the project. That table that you see on the screen reflects what the current Portsmouth range of return expectations are for development, for rental and for ownership. And so we use these metrics. These were collected through a series of interviews. Councilman Tabor is correct in that we are working with the city now, but we have been working with the city on housing analysis for the better part of 4 years now, starting with the housing needs analysis, and then we did a feasibility analysis, and now we're doing this analysis with the city. So we've been collecting and engaging with not just the city staff, but we've also been engaging with the development community and doing market assessment here in the community for a long time. And so these are reflective of the responses to that and our collection of information to understand if you've ever heard the term go, no go. The go, no go decision is whether or not I go, meaning I'm going to do the project if I can reach or achieve at or above the return expectation I want, and no go, obviously, if it falls below. Next, please, Jason. So we built a financial model. Once again, I'm not going to open it up for you, but the model is very dynamic. We were able to look at the financial feasibility based on different areas of the city because rents, for example, vary depending upon where you're located within Portsmouth. Sale prices vary depending upon where you are located in Portsmouth. And it's able to look at difference in location, in the type of development, in the size of the development. If I'm doing something less than 5 stories, it's going to be a wood frame project, which has a different construction cost than if I do 6 stories, which will be a wood frame above a level of concrete and steel, as opposed to a 10-story building where it will be all concrete and steel. So the model allows us to look at a lot of different iterations and understand from different perspectives what is feasible, what is not feasible based on the assumptions that we put into the model. Next, please, Jason. The study focused in on your zoning areas that allow for higher intensity residential development. I realize this is probably a little bit small for you here in the crowd, but we looked and analyzed each of these different areas based on what is allowed to be developed from a zoning, from a regulatory perspective in these different areas. And I'm going to show a graphic in a little bit that will make it a little bit more clear. But we wanted to show kind of where we focused our analysis reflective of areas where different typologies of housing are allowed to be built here in the city. Next, please, Jason. So just a little bit of background information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, especially when you're talking about workforce housing, which here in New Hampshire is defined at 60% of area median income. Okay, we just wanted to give you a little bit of data of understanding of what that means, because at different income thresholds, you have different ability to pay, whether it's a rental property or an ownership property. Your ability to buy something or to rent something is going to be dependent upon what your income is. And so the model for this particular exercise is focused on that 60% of AMI line, because that's what workforce housing is defined at here in New Hampshire. And so when we looked at how much rent can a household pay if they're making 60% of AMI, what could they purchase, a condo or a townhouse or a home if they're at 60% of AMI, and we had to build that into the model so to say that, okay, if we're going to require X% of units to be workforce, then that's going to have an impact on the financial return of those projects. And so this is just to show you what those income thresholds are. And then this is showing you, if you look at, my apologies to those of you at home, at the 60% of AMI threshold is what they could afford to pay in rent for a studio or a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom. So as you can understand, those of you who do rent, or those of you who know the market rate rental market here in Portsmouth, those rents are not reflective of what a traditional market rate rent would be. And so we just wanted to kind of give you some of that flavor and understanding the impact that providing a workforce unit has on the financial feasibility of a project. Next, please, Jason. So I mentioned a moment ago that I'll show you the graphics. We looked at each of the different study areas here on the left-hand side. We looked at what the maximum yield you could get based on the existing language in the zoning code, what the height requirements, the site coverage requirements, so forth and so on. The workforce housing policy basically says you have to provide us with a certain percentage of units, and in exchange we're going to give you some bonus density. So we're going to give you some additional units on top of what you're allowed to do by right. And so this table shows you by the different areas, the different overlays or the zoning classifications here in the city, The max units you're able to build per acre by right, meaning I'm not using bonus density, so I don't have to provide any workforce housing units. The max amount of units you're able to get through the bonus policy, and then what the required set aside would be to be able to achieve or to get access to that bonus. Next, please, Jason. And as you can see, all of them are 60% of AMI, obviously, because that's the workforce definition. So what you're looking at here is our analysis of the rental assessment for each of the different study areas. So if you remember on that first graphic slide where we showed you what rates of return expectation are at different levels, so the red dashed line is the least that an investor would accept. The green dashed line is kind of ideal, okay? The blue columns are what returns are by right, meaning I don't use bonus density and I'm not providing any workforce housing units. The red bars are what my return is if I use the full bonus density, because I'm going to be required to give you the percentage set aside to get access to it. And the biggest takeaway for us is in each of the different study areas, my return is lower taking advantage of the bonus density and having to provide workforce housing units than if I just do a by right project. And so the bottom line is, and I mentioned this earlier, your current policy does not provide an incentive to developers to provide workforce housing units. It provides a financial disincentive. Now, mind you, I want to be very clear. We're speaking about financial incentives and disincentives. We're looking at one very specific component of residential development. We're not talking about the need, or we're not talking about from a economic vibrancy perspective. We're just talking about return, the financial return. And so the punchline here is that all things being equal, if I'm a residential developer building a rental property, I'm not going to take advantage of your workforce housing policy because my return goes down, even though I'm able to build more units. And it's all for the reasons we talked about, which is the rents that you're able to collect for those workforce units, the negative financial impacts of that are greater than the benefit of being able to build more units than I'm allowed by right. So that's the punchline. Hopefully that makes sense. And by the way, we'll be happy to take questions, and we're going to have some questions that we're going to have you answer, and then I'm happy to engage in conversation once we're done with the presentation. Next, please, Jason. We also did this analysis for ownership. The biggest difference being that for ownership, some of the percentage set-aside requirements are different in your current policy than they are for rental. And then the target is 100% of AMI and not 60% of AMI. So those are the two primary differences between an ownership project and a rental project under the workforce housing policy. Next, please, Jason. And so when we did that analysis, same result is while rates of return are appropriate based on our understanding of current market conditions, my ability to generate a rate of return using the workforce housing policy to get bonus density units makes my project perform worse financially. So it was the same kind of result. Next, please, Jason. So the implications of this, I think it's not very hard to understand. One is that it limits the opportunity for implementation, and while you can actually still make at or above ideal optimum returns using it, you can't make at or above your returns if you don't. And that's the biggest problem we have. And for me, the big takeaway there, and I mentioned this to Peter, is one of the findings from this analysis for us is for communities in New Hampshire to work with the state legislature to change the law to allow workforce housing policies to be compulsory rather than voluntary, like they have in Massachusetts. That will go a long way for you to be able to implement a more performative policy that will be able to generate more workforce housing units but still provide financial return to investors. Some of the overlay districts create further financial challenges. Frankly, sometimes the 20% set-aside requirement is extremely aggressive. Most communities putting in a workforce housing or an inclusionary zoning or an affordable dwelling unit, they're all the different words that mean the same thing, which is income-controlled housing as part of a new residential development. Most communities, when they're getting out of the gate, don't start at 20% because there is a tremendous financial shock to the market. Getting to 20% oftentimes is something communities do over a period of time. So clients that we work with that have existing zoning policies where they say, hey, we're at 10% right now and we want to get to 20. We'll do the analysis, say, well, you can maybe you can get to 15, but if you want to do 20, that's going to be like a 5 or 10 year process. So that other kind of finding to us is asking for 20 is very aggressive, particularly in a voluntary policy. And then, frankly, there needs to be adjustment. And we're going to give you a recommendation, one option of many that you have, but we're going to give you a recommendation of how we can get to that financial viability that actually creates an incentive. And I'm sure all of you who have ever looked at real estate financial analysis knows that what that means is getting fewer workforce housing units so that we can accomplish the financial return that needs to be there. Next, please, Jason. The first one we're going to talk about is applying the workforce housing requirement, the 20% or the 10%, which depending upon which district you're in, to only the bonus units. So rather than applying it to the entire project, you apply that 20% to the bonus units that you get. And so what that does is, rather than, because for example, I think in the GNOD subdistrict, the bonus requirement is the same, the bonus density is the same as the number of workforce housing units you're required to provide. So basically that bonus makes you make all of them workforce housing units. And that's kind of the reason why, from a financial perspective, it doesn't work. Because if I'm giving you an extra 30 units, but you have to provide 30 income-controlled units, then I'm basically making a financial disincentive, not a financial incentive. When we did the analysis, what we looked at is if you apply it just to the bonus units, now it's only one of the bonus units for every 4 market rate units you provide. That creates the financial return needed to overcome the financial impact of those reduced rents. And we'll show you a graphic in just a moment. That's the first opportunity. Provide regulatory benefits or financial incentives to development units. So there are a number of funding programs out there. Many of them are already being used, like low-income housing tax credits. I'm sure there are projects that have taken advantage of those financial subsidies here in the city in the past. But there's a lot of opportunity, and we're going to talk about that, of what that means and what that looks like under your current policy. And there was a third thing we looked at, which it doesn't solve the problem, but it levels it out. Right now, in your current housing policy, if the bonus analysis calculates that IOU 5.4 units, it rounds up to 6, rather than 5 units and then a partial payment. And so one of our recommendations is, rather than just rounding everything up, is if they owe you a partial unit, like a 0.4 of a unit, you just make them pay 40% of the buyout price, rather than having to deliver a whole unit, which creates less of a fine. And then we'll show you what that means in just a moment. So next, Jason, please. I don't know, where's the rest of the slide, buddy? Thank you. And so we talked about applying the set-aside requirements to just the bonus units. So picking on GNOD, for example, you're allowed to you can max at 130 based on the current policy. You get a bonus of 33 units, which is the addition you're allowed to have, but it's 20% of that 163, which is 33. That's the math I was talking about earlier. Our recommendation is saying, no, calculate the 20% just on the 33 bonus units. So they'll provide 6 or 7 workforce housing units if they're maxing out the density. Now, mind you, this is theoretical based on what your code is. It's not necessarily what people are going to build. But what it does is, rather than requiring 33 units, it requires 7 units onto the project. And we did the same thing for each of the other different districts here. And show the next slide, please, Jason. And you can see the difference in impact. Same range, same return, which is the blue, the new rate of return applying the set aside to just the bonus units. And so what has happened is, rather than creating a financial disincentive from a return perspective, you're actually creating a slight incentive for an investor to use the bonus density and provide workforce housing units. So simply put, it can work. It's just not going to yield as many workforce housing units as if you required 20% across the whole project, is the punchline here. Next, please, Jason. And we did it, it works, it has a similar effect both for rental and ownership. Alternative two is the financial inducements into the project. So if we're not willing to change the set aside being applied to the full project and just to the bonus density, our first recommendation is to consider, what it would cost from a dollar amount out of pocket to cover the difference between what the rate of return is as a by right project to get that rate of return back up by using the bonus density and having to provide workforce housing units. And we just did an example in the GNOT area of the city, 20% at 60% of NMI, which is the current requirement, would require about $7.5 million of capital outlay at the beginning of the project, and that would cover, for a project that's developing 130 units, that would be financially sufficient to bring the return back up to where it was as a by right project without using the bonus density and not providing any workforce housing. Or about $46,000, $47,000 a door. If you can think of it that way, the financial impact to the developer is about, if I'm rounding, $50,000 for every workforce housing unit that they provide. It's a financial loss. The alternative, we try to find a compromise that said, rather than asking for 20% at 60, ask for 10% at 60. So we lowered the set-aside requirement, and that reduced it from $7.5 million to about $3.5 million. And so, or about $25,000 a unit. Obviously, in our little example here, you'd be getting 33 workforce units at 20%, cost you $7.5 million, or you'd be getting 16 units, and it would cost you about $3.5 million. And so we wanted to show you the alternative of reducing the requirement to what the financial impact is, that a replacement for those dollars would need to be found to get a developer, builder, to be willing to take advantage of the workforce housing policy. Next, please, Jason. And I mentioned this, while this is not the solution, going to a partial unit strategy. And over here, I know it's very hard to see, but we kind of gave you a table of, the number of units and then the partial calculation. What this graphic here is showing you on the lower right corner of the screen, to my folks online, is how return is impacted as you reach and pass a whole unit. So 0.1 being rounded up to the next whole number has a substantial negative impact on return. Because if I only owe you a tenth of a unit, but I have to deliver you a whole unit, that's a greater financial impact for just adding one more unit to my project. And so by going to a partial payment, so if I owe you 20.2 units, I give you 20 units and I pay you the value of 20% of a unit, which is set by this committee, you can see how it smooths out that return line. Well, what that does is it removes the disincentives for a developer to maximize the yield of the lot. So if I can build 20 units and my return is only going to be 11% because of the calculation, or I can build 19 units and my return goes up because I owe you one less workforce housing unit, I'll just build 19 even though I could build 20. And the reason why that benefits the city is the shortage of units is not just at the low end. Part of the reason why rents and cost of housing continues to escalate faster than incomes here is because there's more demand than there is supply. And so allowing builders, developers, to maximize what they can actually get on their property can actually help address housing need in the community, because for every additional market rate unit you provide, that's one more naturally occurring affordable unit that is not in competition with someone who can afford to pay more. And so as a result, it will help slow down. It's not going to stop it. Let's be realistic here, but it'll help slow down some of the escalation that goes on because developers choose not to maximize what they can build because of the impact of a policy like this. So punchlining it at the back end, what's the next slide? Yeah, okay. Before we jump into this, keep your phones. Hold on. I know. There's a QR code. We're all very excited. We'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, but the punchline for us is the policy right now doesn't meet what you're trying to accomplish. It doesn't create an incentive for an investor to be willing to take advantage of the bonus density to provide workforce housing units. We provided you with a couple of alternatives of how to address it. Reduce the expectation, so apply the set-aside requirement to just the bonus units, not the whole project. Find financial resources to invest in projects to help cover the difference. A hybrid of those can be it. And the use of the partial unit rule will help eliminate when a developer gets to, oh, the next unit's going to cost me more than, so I'm just not going to build it. And by the way, that's not unique to here. We work with communities throughout New England that have a roundup rule. We call it the roundup rule, where if I owe you 0.1 units, I have to round up. They all are impacted by the same challenges, which is if I add one more market rate unit, but you take that market rate unit away and make it into an income controlled unit, like a workforce housing unit, it's better than if I just don't deliver it at all. And so that's a common strategy that we work with lots of communities here in New England. So now on to the fun part of the show, all right? By the way, happy to answer questions on anything that we just talked about. Yes, sir.
So on the slide deck, it had the calculation of $7.5 million for what it would cost to sort of
Make the project hit the same return as a by right project.
What was the time associated with that? Like over how many years is that $7.5 million?
Day one. You have to provide that at, it's a cash inducement when they're doing the project. So it's not, let me rephrase my question. If you wanted to do a 10-year payment on that, like a tax increment financing thing, you would have to then calculate what it would need to be, maybe like $12 million over 10 years would be the equivalent of giving them $7.5 million today. So you would have to, we would have to math out what that time value of money would be with a longitudinal incentive to equate to $7.5 million in today's money. Does that make sense? Okay.
Was there calculation done to understand the cost of impact of the development on the city in terms of the services versus the estimated tax value?
No, a fiscal impact analysis was not part of this study. It was just how can we get our policy to be effective to be able to deliver more workforce housing units.
So the scenario is like a tax rebate, we don't know, like if that there's a net positive still for the city in the case where there's like a tax rebate going on.
Correct. We didn't do that level of the analysis. That was not part of what we were asked to do. Yes, sir.
Curious, did you look at other types of bonus like criteria, like additional stories, FAR, fewer parking requirements, other ways to induce units to be more profitable for a product such that there is more margin to fund the desired goal?
Yes. So one of the and thank you, Peter. That's my fault for not asking you to do that already. The question was, for those of you who didn't hear, is did we look at any other tools, either like increasing the density allowances or providing parking space waivers and additional height, which, by the way, is also in just density. So, and the answer to that question is we did, and here's the challenge. In most of these areas, the city is already extremely generous in allowances of units per acre, so that density number. The way the policies are written, in most of them, you're able to do a level of intensity, frankly, I'm not sure the market would want to do on its own. And so there's a challenge there because I'm already able to do so much. Giving me more doesn't really help me. Does that make sense? Parking waivers can be helpful. I would encourage strongly that the city be careful about that because there's only certain parts of the city where not providing parking makes a lot of sense, where there's already good access to services and already existing transportation options other than a car. It also doesn't really move the needle a ton. You were talking about going down to like zero parking, and I think, except for maybe one or two very specific places in the city, I'm not sure the market would be interested in that.
Why not just let the developers choose?
Well, you could, but if they're going to build the parking anyway, the question was why not just let they could, but if they're going to build the parking anyway, then the incentive doesn't create any financial benefits. Does that make sense? So if they're, and I'm going to make this up, they're required to give me a space per unit, but we're going to let you do zero, but they choose to do a space per unit anyway, well, then they get no financial benefit from that, even though they're allowed to, if that makes any sense. Yes, sir. Oh, hold on a second. Peter's going to give you a microphone. I'm not going to make the same mistake 3 times.
Okay, so I'm one of the housing advocates here, sprinkled around tonight. We're very interested to read your housing market study that you did 3 years ago. And you were able to project an unmet demand for rentals of 2,897 units, of which approximately 55% should be AMI at 80% or less. So we're interested in the big picture. We've actually created, in fact, one of our members over there created a dashboard where we keep track of all of the housing projects in the city, market rate and affordable. And so we know exactly where those things are. So one of the questions I've got for you is that with these options, are you able to model potential uptake of these incentives? Given the fact that this is obviously a changing picture, we've got a whole bunch of occupancy permits have just been passed this year, so a lot of market rate units have come on. So there must be a certain ceiling for market rate development, and these incentives kind of depend on market rate developments.
Yep.
So are you able to do any modeling to come up with potential ranges of units that these incentives would produce?
We are. So the answer to your direct answer to your question is yes. That was not part of what we were tasked to do here. So we did not do that, but we do have the capability of saying if these are put in place, what could that generally yield based on current investment levels in the city?
Could you two stick around for 5 years and do more of this?
Well, I'll talk to Peter. I mean, I absolutely can. But there's a catch to that, and I think you know what it is. But no, it's definitely something that can be looked at and can be analyzed to try and understand what that would mean. I want to address another point you made just quickly, which is there a ceiling for even market rate units? And I would argue the ceiling is probably greater than what the city is is in position to accept, because the demand to be on the seacoast, in the city of Portsmouth, within striking distance of Boston, is substantial.
You'd be surprised. Young people want to live here. We should build housing for them.
Oh no, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that the demand is. I think the demand will outpace supply. I'm not sure the city could accommodate what the demand would be if it was allowed.
We'd have to build more on single-family parts of the city up to the map, which we should do. But that's fine.
Yes, sir.
This is great. This is really good. I'm a developer, so I know how this stuff works. But are you confident, or is your experience in other places in New England that the developers will actually take advantage of this? Because it's kind of a hassle. But
Yes, I mean, I think if the return calculation, now once again, so as you know, when we model, we're looking at averages and ranges, and so every project is going to be different. That being said, I do believe that if the policy can provide a better return, I think the private market would take advantage of it, because as you know, and as everybody else inherently probably knows, units provided at 60% of AMI, if demand for market rate is substantial, the demand for income controlled units is almost guaranteed. And so the challenge though is making a return on it, not if I could fill it.
yeah, definitely, yes. I did want to mention to the city people here, since I used to work in Massachusetts for the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, where I was recommending affordable housing using the compulsory law there, which we're never going to get in New Hampshire. But you're going to have someone who's going to regulate these units because they're probably, they're deed restricted, and we had that problem in Massachusetts that they were flipping and someone wasn't honoring the regulatory agreement, because tax credit housing is heavily regulated.
Yep.
So it's just going to be maybe the housing authority wants to do it.
Well, I appreciate that point, because while we're not talking about implementation on the back end of this, in our experience of working throughout Massachusetts as well, and working with a lot of very heavy hitter communities that do this, Cambridge, Somerville, Newton, Boston are all previous clients of ours, is yes, the monitoring is a critical component, because those communities that don't have a strong monitoring strategy, sometimes those units get lost. And that's an appropriate thought as the city moves forward in this process.
Hi, just for a point of clarification, we do have that set up through the Portsmouth Housing Authority. Awesome. So like on Lafayette with the deed restricted units that are going up for sale, those will be monitored through PHA. and everything else that goes through this type of program is. So we do have the infrastructure, and actually I think, one of the projects that we've talked about within staff and some of the counselors was following up to see how that is going. Like with West End Yards, their income-driven units are, I guess, like managed in that sense through the Portsmouth Housing Authority. So one of the things that the city is looking at over the next few months is meeting with the developers or the landholders that use the income-based model for these units and see how the PHA partnership and management of that is going.
Well, thank you so much, and that's fantastic to hear, because that has been proven in our experience to be the most efficient manner of doing it. The housing authority is already set up to do that through the programs that they monitor and look at. So adding a handful more really is not a substantial impact on them. It's great that you have the relationship. Not every community has the same relationship with their corresponding housing authority to be able to do that. So that's fantastic. It is. Before I answer any more questions, I'm going to pause the questions just for a moment. Now is the time to whip out all your cell phones or personal computing devices. I don't want to be Jason yell at me later and tell me that I'm too old to not know that there's also personal computing devices. But this QR code is going to take you to just a couple of questions. And so once you get in there, you can go into the questions. Hopefully you can answer the questions. Those of you who are watching at home, if you're able to scan the QR code, you'll also be able to answer the questions. I'm going to go back to answering questions for about 4 or 5 more minutes to allow everybody the opportunity to go through and do this. And then we're going to pull up the results of what we got from the folks that have participated. If you do not have a personal computer, yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Yes,
Is it
ma'am.
time for questions again?
Give me one moment. Okay. If you don't have a personal computing device here, I apologize, but we only have these questions virtually, but we are going to talk through them after everybody responds. So please feel free to go ahead and do that now. Now I'll answer your question. Yes, ma'am.
So as far as our zoning goes, you've seen that we have a lot of projects that just do the by right numbers. So the question is, we have one project in specific that we've talked a lot about the fact that they didn't even take the full density by right. So would it make sense to actually lower the by right density in order to make incentives work?
Theoretically, yes. If the by right number was lower, then you could use the density bonus as the incentive to provide more return. There's a lot of challenges that go with that, and I'm sure you all are aware of that. But yes, from a math perspective, that is an option.
You mentioned other cities that you've worked with before. I'm just curious, what is the end goal here, and have you seen this succeed in other jurisdictions? And like, what is the lesson for us here? When you talk about, say, Cambridge or these other places that for many decades have tried to, go this route of limiting development, undersupply, set aside some units in programs that, have some challenges in being effective. Has there ever been success in hitting hey, we've built enough income restricted units to solve our highest housing needs here, or even having a percentage of the housing stock year after year being a part of these programs? And if not, are we just sort of doing this to feel good about ourselves while our market becomes increasingly out of reach every year, where people of my generation with families keep moving out? People with good jobs don't want to live in income restricted units. They just want a market rate unit that is sort of priced at a level where the people who work here can afford it. So I'm just curious, are there other jurisdictions where this approach has ever worked before in America?
So you've asked.
How would you define that?
You asked 3 questions. I will answer all 3.
Thank you.
So the first question you asked is, has any community ever met their housing need? The answer to that is no, because the demand for housing need transcends jurisdictional boundaries. So someone mentioned the number of 2,798 a moment ago. That's based on an assumption of serving natural growth, projected growth to Portsmouth, okay? If 5,000 housing units were built, there would be people who would come here because the projection is based off of historic growth rates and expected development. And if you change the dynamic, the impact would be different, because in the Boston metro region, one of the unique things for those of you who are not aware about the Boston metro region is about half of your MSA is the Atlantic Ocean. So while where I live in Washington, D.C., we have land mass to the east of us and the northeast of us and the southeast of us, you have a gigantic body of water. And so my point of that is in this region, you are particularly challenged because you have much less land area to meet similar demand. Okay? So the answer to your first question is, has anyone ever met their need? No, because the need will continue to increase as you create opportunities. Demand will shift. They'll see an opportunity and they'll go take advantage of it, particularly to the point you made earlier. And as I said, Portsmouth is a very desirable place to be. Okay? The second part of your question is, has it produced the results they want? The answer is yes, because left to the market's devices, they are going to build to the greatest profit return, which means I'm going to charge market rate rents. And those market rate rents are based on the demand of the most people to pay. Not necessarily the people who are working there, but the people who want to live there and have the ability to pay. An easy example of this is a city like Cambridge or Somerville, where you had thousands upon thousands of life science jobs created, paying well above six figures. A lot of the boom in rent escalation was because there's so many more people moved in that had more ability to pay. Why am I going to build an apartment at $2,500 a month when I can build an apartment at $5,000 a month? And so the market is going to go after where they're able to maximize their returns. And by the way, sometimes they're forced to. Part of that life science impact was it drove up construction cost price. Because I could rent a life science building for $130 a square foot. That means I can charge more to build it because there's more of a margin. And so that then trickles into the residential development marketplace, right? Because as a carpenter, and I'm not picking on carpenters, I can work for $400 an hour on this project or $200 an hour on this project. I'm just going to work for $400. You want to hire me? It's $400 because it's my opportunity cost. So yes, I think the answer to your second question is, have they done it to achieve a goal, which is to create more price diversity than they were going to have? Absolutely. I think the answer is yes. I can't give you hard numbers off the top of my head. Jason's probably staring a hole through the back of my head because he probably knows them off the top of his head for Newton and for Somerville. But yes, I believe the answer is it does. The third question you asked is, are we just doing this to make ourselves feel good? The answer is no, because even though it is highly unlikely that any jurisdiction, not just Portsmouth, will be able to meet all of the need, if you don't do this, the do-nothing scenario is it just gets worse. You are mitigating the impact through strategies and policies of trying to prolong and lengthen the ability of your community to be diverse to a number of different people. And by the way, this is just one tool. And that also has to be the thing is the workforce housing policy is a single tool. The strongest tool in the income appropriate housing development is low-income housing tax credits through the federal government. That by far is the greatest financial tool and create a lot of opportunities. Somerville implemented a expedited development process if 100% of your units were income controlled. And the only way you're able to do that is through low-income housing tax credits because you can't make that project work no matter what you do. And so they were able to take advantage of it, and they've seen a number of projects come through that process into developments that are fully priced at 30, 50, 60% of AMI. And so it does have an impact. Unfortunately, the bigger problem, and you kind of mentioned one of the solutions here, is so the bigger problem is we're just not allowing enough development in a small enough space to be able to truly affect that in a meaningful way. And I don't have the sociological solution to that. Man, if I knew that, I would have written a book years ago and I'd be living in the Cayman Islands, living on my dive boat and manning my bar. Yes, sir. And then you're next, sir.
So, we're highlighting one tool. We're highlighting one tool that you just alluded to, and this is all within zoning reform or policy change. However, in the city of Portsmouth, we have 15.5 square miles plus or minus a few, and on top of that, we have a PULA study that generally indicates we have sub 1% of open land in the public realm. And then beyond that, we have a downtown corridor that also has a historic component to it. So creating more units on a smaller tract of land is generally more difficult. On top of that, we have a parking requirement, we have a parking ratio. So if I could go on and on with that. However, we also have generally old housing stock in this area with an aging population and demographic. So while this is all very effective and true, with our GNOD, we're making headway on it. With our changes in incentives or bonuses, we're making headway on it. But have you considered, or to what extent have you considered changing some of the existing single-family policy or lower density policies? Because when I talked to Craig Welch about PHA, about some of these smaller projects, it's immediately, we generally can't make anything under 40 units work. And in Portsmouth, that's a lot of properties. So if you can't do that on an affordable low-income tax basis feasibility, how else can we do that? Because we're eliminating huge swaths of Portsmouth just by these criteria alone. And if we continue in this cycle of doing that, we're going to hit ourselves in the head over and over and over again, when in reality we have a lot of older housing stock that should be considered in a different light.
Yes. I'll give you my serious answer first.
Thank you.
Okay. Which is that there probably are a lot of underutilized parcels here. First, like I said, first of all, your overlay districts actually are very aggressive. And you saw the map. That's not everywhere in Portsmouth. But at least in the areas where you've created these overlay districts, you have gotten more aggressive to try and provide a greater level of intensity of development to create more. Okay, which is great, which is fantastic. But it is a relatively small swath, land area-wise, of the community. I wrapped up a project in Charlottesville, Virginia, about a year ago. They eliminated their single-family zoning. That was a strategy I know, I think Minneapolis has done a similar thing as well. I have not worked in Minneapolis in that regard, but I did. And they looked at ways that they could encourage large lot, underutilized parcels to do infill or to redevelop. It will have an impact on that community if it gets approved, but it's in lawsuit right now. And technically right now, as of about a week ago, a judge, Charlottesville has no zoning because they have put a stop on their ability to use their zoning, so they can't develop anything until it gets resolved in the courts. I don't know Portsmouth as well as you guys do, but that is a very contentious conversation in any community of, do we look at our single family areas and see if there's ways to intensify in and around those? But that is a solution. I'm going to throw out another crazy one, okay? Peas. No housing is allowed in Peas. It's a ginormous piece of land in your community. I'm not here, I don't know the politics of it, I don't know the deed restrictions of it. RKG worked on the Peas privatization back in 1988. I was 14 years old, for those of you who are, so I did not work on that project with the principals who were in charge at the time. But that's another area where you are hamstrung, where there's a large chunk of land that can't be used to try and help solve this problem. As we were kind of just talking about, I don't believe there is a way for Portsmouth, there's no simple solution for Portsmouth to be able to address all of its housing needs. Continuing to try and do the best you can oftentimes is the best a community can do. I did a housing study for Montgomery County, Maryland, which is the northern edge of the city of Washington, D.C., which is where I live. When I looked at their housing needs analysis, just of the people who lived there at that point in time, it was like $1.5 billion of housing investment needed to address the affordability needs of the people who lived there at that moment. Even a county like Montgomery County doesn't have $1.5 billion. The solution that I believe you're looking for, that you're asking about, is one that's going to require a combination of the city, the state, and the federal government, and the residents to seriously take a look and say, what do we want? What are we willing to do about this? And then try and do the best that you can. I wish I could tell you there's a solution, but there really isn't, because we as a country, this has nothing to do with your community, have made this mess, if you will. And unwinding it is going to be very difficult. And especially given that there's still a lot of people out there that don't want to see change. And that's probably going to be the number one issue that you run into when you look at things. Communities that have been successful, they look at shopping centers, they look at commercial corridors, they look at industrial areas, and they say, how can we infill and maximize there because that's where you're generally going to get the least resistance, because you're not trying to put it right on top of or right in the middle of an existing single-family detached neighborhood. And so that's another way, is you can continue to look at areas where you have, but Portsmouth is uniquely constrained because of your size, because of the availability of undeveloped land, and because of some of the unique barriers you have, like a historic downtown, which is generally where a lot of higher intensity development occurs, where they take down a 3-story building, they put up a 15-story building. That's just not something that I believe can happen here. And so you do have some unique things that are going against you.
Unique and also extremely beneficial. And downtown is beauteous in infinite amount of ways, which is great. And it also attracts a lot of money,
Yes.
because a lot of these condos generate a lot of property tax. And so that's great, sure. Now, if we look beyond the downtown and in the Route 1 corridor, where a lot of the front street-facing parcels could be changed, that's all well and good. But if you take the Market Basket Plaza, which I don't know if you're familiar with, it's a plaza of about 5 acres, and Market Basket has no incentive to change that plaza whatsoever.
Correct.
Nor would they ever, because of the amount of parking they have for their shop. So all of that considered, we are looking at a state that has no income tax, no estate tax, and no death costs, effectively. And so people are buying properties here and will continue to buy properties here for that sole reason alone. So that is one innate and intrinsic demand to the state and to our area that makes it extremely desirable. That's not going anywhere. And number two is we have a lot of empty bedrooms. And when we are counting bedrooms, much like a college community would, that then creates excess fat for the properties that are most desirable to convert to multifamily, like some of the older Victorian homes that are converted on Islington Street or what have you. So that's kind of my point. But I think these are initial starts, but maybe there's not, again, an end point to it.
Okay, that gentleman there. Jason, how are we doing on the responses?
I can pull them up.
Are you getting, excuse me for just one moment. You can go next, sir.
Let me check.
All right, check it out. Yes, sir.
This is very interesting, and I'll be honest, it took me a while to get there. My initial reaction was fairly negative to these suggestions, but after some consideration, hearing it through, I got there. I think something, and I'm curious if any analysis was done. I think we're going to have to, this is going to need to be sold to the community in a way, and I'm curious if any analysis was done to say if this policy was put in place 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we would have X number of workforce housing units today that we don't.
It was not, because that was not part of our study, but to the point, the question that you asked, sir, that's something that we could look at if that's something that the city is interested in having that information. But more to the point of what you're saying is, you're right, it is going to need to be sold to the community because it's a change. And, listen, I've been around the block long enough to know that, especially when you're talking about land use changes and especially around housing, it's very emotional and it's very visceral. And so having information like that could benefit that conversation to be able to put facts in front of folks rather than feelings. Not that feelings are bad, but having facts definitely helps make the conversation more focused. Over here. Oh, I'm sorry. And then you're next, sir.
Okay, I don't understand question 1 on your survey there, because what you said about putting the incentives only on the additional units made sense, but I'm not sure that that's what question 1 means, because...
Jason, can you pull up?
So can you kind of explain
Yep, we're going to pull it
to
up
me?
right now. I wish I could tell you I can remember exactly what the question says, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Can you switch over to that, please? Yep. Okay, thank you. I know it takes a minute. Do you support reducing the potential number of in-control units? So yeah, so it's basically applying the set-aside requirement to just the bonus units rather than the entire project.
Okay. All right, good.
Yes, okay. I apologize about that. Him and then you next, Counselor.
Thank you. I know your study has been focused within the boundaries of the city. That's who you have the agreement with. Have you ever developed any particular strategy that looked from a regional perspective, from a, let's say you have a city with a lot of activity, but the surrounding towns have available land for development, and how do you, have you ever developed any type of strategy to bring in surrounding communities who have the same problem, so that we can, the single, in this case, is it Portsmouth's obligation to satisfy the concerns of housing when other communities are going to be, can gain the same benefit if they become engaged in the process? Have you ever developed a strategy like that?
So yes, so we worked in the Allegheny region of Pennsylvania, which is where Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton, Pennsylvania are, just on the New Jersey line, for those of you who are not familiar. We did a jobs housing balance analysis and looked at their unmet need for their labor force, and we looked at each of the different municipalities that made up those two counties. And we identified the need not just for the region as a whole, but how it varied within the region. And so we have worked with communities to try and help them find those solutions. The challenges to all of those strategies is the reality that each community controls its own land use and its own money. And while we can show that, you need 50 and you need 80 and you need 72 and you need 130, that's the water's edge. There is no way for us as a consultant, for an MPO, a metropolitan planning organization who's looking at from a regional perspective, or in this case, the city of Portsmouth, to go and say, hey, you also have this need. I think the closest solution that I could think of is Massachusetts 40B law, which requires every community to have a minimum of 10% of their units qualify. I think it's like 80% of AMI. I don't know the exact law off the top of my head, but the state requires every community to provide some level of it. And if you don't have your quota, then there's a process for developers to use a comprehensive approval process that bypasses your zoning if you meet certain requirements. But that only is in effect until you hit your quota, and then that goes away again. So my answer to you is that if that is something that is to be done, really the most effective way here in New Hampshire would be for the state legislature to put in a similar policy. And yet again, as I encourage the city to work with other municipalities to lobby the state legislature to allow workforce housing policies to be compulsory, I would also encourage you to work with other communities to try and get them to put in something similar to that. It's in a live free or die state. By the way, I lived here for about 16 months back in 1998, 1999 when I first started with RKG. In a live free or die state, that's going to be a very challenging thing to do in a community that embraces its liberties and freedoms. That's a requirement. And so we have worked on it. There are examples of success. Those examples of success are well beyond the capabilities of the city of Portsmouth to execute. Councilman Tabor, please. Anyone want to, after? Okay, good. Then the mic doesn't have to go too far.
Some of us on the Housing Committee talked to some developers to get their point of view. One pointed out that our area, our AMI, our statistical area includes Rochester and Dover. So 60% of AMI, when you include Rochester, is much different than 60% of Portsmouth. 60% of Portsmouth is $105,000.
Yep.
And maybe this is a legal question, but would we be smarter to look at giving the density bonus in exchange for 80%, which might be more like Portsmouth's real 60%?
So, Councilman Tabor, I think your question is a legal one, and I'm not a lawyer, and Jason and I are not staying in a Holiday Inn Express tonight. So I would say that's a conversation to have with your city attorney's office of whether or not you're allowed to do that, because what I do know is New Hampshire's workforce definition in the policy set by the state is 60% of AMI for rental and 100% of AMI for ownership. And so what I don't know is, are you allowed to do something different than that? And that is a legal question that I don't have the answer to. That being said, I have worked in communities. The community in which I live, Alexandria, Virginia, does that. They have a policy for their dollars that you can't apply it to federal dollars. So like if you're trying to use home or HUD or CDBG or something like that, you have to follow the rules. But for City of Alexandria dollars, they've established their own 80% because, similar to you guys, there are other municipalities that make up the metro region that Alexandria is part of that bring down that average. And by the way, Boston has the same problem. I've done an IZ study in Boston, and I've done an IZ study in Lowell. And you want to talk about how the other influences the other in a negative way. Those are two perfect examples.
Second question is, some of our developers said density obviously is your friend. And I don't think there's any appetite for more than 5 stories in the historic downtown. But there might be some fringe areas or former retail areas, former industrial areas, where we might be able to do some 10-story. Did you run any, can you run your model for 10-story steel and elevators, and does that make a significant difference?
We did, and it does, and it makes it all terrible. Because the cost of construction for concrete and steel is not justified by your market rate rents and sale prices. The delta between a wood frame, where it's wood construction, and concrete and steel is like 40–50% more costs. And if I'm not getting any more, I can't charge more just because the building is taller. So when we ran concrete and steel through the model, everything just goes down because the cost differential to what revenues generate just doesn't work. And that's a common problem with most everywhere except for Back Bay, Beacon Hill, Seaport, and I think you know where I'm talking about. So,
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about single family again. So you said, basically, if I paraphrase what you said about the reason single family wasn't viable is because people don't like it, and it's hard to do in terms of like politically. You said, well,
incorporating multi-unit development in single family neighborhoods. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes, it is very challenging.
Yeah, people don't like it, right? But you also said that facts are more important than feelings to some degree. And what's a little bit concerning to me is that we have analysis on developer-oriented, sort of incentive-based approach, but we don't have an analysis on what would it mean for the tax base for 60%, 70% of the buildable land in the city of Portsmouth to have its zoning changed to some degree. And this is sort of maybe a comment to the city and to the councilors, because there was this motion around like what can we do, and that wasn't even talked about. We don't get the facts, and so I guess my ask here a little bit is we need the analysis, we need the numbers on the total view of the land that we have and what upzoning the majority of the buildable land would mean for finances in terms of taxes, for impact, and on the housing side.
I appreciate that. And we've done fiscal impact analyses for communities to understand what those impacts are, and that is another data point that would help make decisions. Now, and we'll get to you just a moment, but I also want to say facts are more important than feelings, but feelings still have a lot of weight. I just want to be very clear in that, okay? I'm not trying to pump one up and discount the other. In a conversation, though, I want you to say to me, I don't want it because I don't want it. That's your right to have an opinion. What the facts do allows you to say, if you do this to the point you just made, it's going to make us raise our taxes by 100%. That's a fact that we can analyze and remove that part of the conversation. That doesn't change people's right to have an opinion of what they want and what they don't want in their community. I just wanted to make sure that it's not binary like that. Feelings are still part of it, but for us, we want the conversation to be focused on what the true issue is, not a lot of times, unfortunately, what some of the things that are brought up when conversations around development occur. And you all know what they are. It's going to raise our taxes. It's going to clog our schools. It's going to clog our roads. It's going to decrease our property values, and it's going to increase crime.
Are any of those things true in your opinion?
Are they true to the extent of what they're trying to get across? No. But that's the point of the data, is we can remove the wheat from the chaff and get to the true issue, which is I just don't like it, which is a person's right to have that opinion. But that's, to me, how you frame the conversation so that your decision makers are making a decision based off of actual information, and then they get the lovely opportunity to make those choices in that arena. Yes, ma'am.
So, Mike, I have two questions. The first one's around parking minimums, and you discussed them, but only on these large-scale projects, because it seems to me like you're looking for kind of a large-scale, like a solution that fits kind of across these zoning areas.
Yep.
So, what about looking at changing parking minimums in single-family residential, in general residence zones, so that you can allow for more infill for ADUs, splitting into multifamilies or duplexes without having to have that additional 2 to 3 parking spots in a single, a residential zone that has ample street parking first. Second, I want to echo the comments about single family, because we have some softer density residential in general residence A and general residence B, that you could switch single family to. And if we haven't looked at that, I want somebody to actually look at that, because that allows for increased density in residential, single family residential, without going to large multi plex buildings. You're just dividing houses or doing additions. I don't think that that's something that you guys necessarily looked at, and that's something that I was particularly concerned about. And then the third thing is looking at eliminating parking minimums in our higher density zones, like our downtown districts, so that we get diversity of housing options. For example, apartments that don't cater to necessarily high end because they don't have parking. Mm-hmm. So somebody that's providing for a different demographic that's not looking for parking.
Yes. So you're correct. The workforce housing policy doesn't kick in until 6 units. So that was a limitation of our studies. We didn't look at anything 5 units or below. So the single family ADU was not part of the study. There is value to understanding that at those scales, because it is a different analysis, if I'm being very honest, than what was tasked through this grant that the city received, and information arguably worth having if that's something that the city is considering. So yes, I go back to the comment that this gentleman had before he left, was that you can offer parking reductions, but if I can sell a $3 million condo and park it, or I could rent a $1,500 a month apartment and not park it. I mean, the math is easy in that regard. And so parking reductions are beneficial to someone who's trying to do that. It's not necessarily beneficial of someone trying to maximize their return. Does that make sense? And that's not with math I've done here. That's just our experience in working with other communities. Did someone else have their hand up that I missed? Young man in the front row.
So if there are two options, one is build more and the other is maximize what you have. The work that you've done has been on the build more side here. But you've got rooming houses, rentals, duplexes, co-living, ADUs. Is it right to think that the make better use of what you have elements are faster to do and quantum less expensive to do?
So here's going to be my crappy consultant response, which is it depends. As I said, every project is different. I can think of examples in other communities I worked where trying to get an ADU policy through or trying to get an ADU developed is very, very challenging because of requirements that were put in place that didn't take into account all the different permutations. And so someone comes in and wants to do an ADU, and for example, their property doesn't allow them to do a separate unit, like a physically separate unit, or the way their house is built, they can't provide a second access point into the ADU unit. And so I believe that there are benefits to both approaches. I believe that communities that are truly trying to address this approach both how do we use what we have better as well as how do we get more, because this is one of those situations where it's an all hands on deck thing. There is no one singular solution that's going to be effective for everything. I've never worked, well, let me change that. In my experience, I have not worked in a community where a single strategy was going to be able to address what the need was. In a community like this, where you do have older housing stock, where you may have some subdivisions or neighborhoods, whatever you call them, where it's a smaller house on a larger lot, there's opportunity there, and it should be taken advantage of because that can be part of the solution. I don't believe it's one or the other. We were asked to, this grant was given to the city to address a very specific mission, And that's what we did. All these questions about all these other stuff are fantastic and appropriate. Unfortunately, just not part of what the state was willing to, state provided resources to do. I don't believe it's this or that. I believe it's this and that. And I think looking at it that holistically way is really the best way to chip away at the issue. And back to the point of that gentleman is it's still not going to be the solution for all of it. That I have yet to work in a community where we've been able to figure that out just because of such a gap between supply and demand. Then again, I've never worked in Wyoming, so maybe that's where my comments don't work. I don't know if for those of you who live in Wyoming who's ever done this, tell me if I'm wrong, but in areas like this, where there's substantial population growth, there's substantial employment growth, and there's substantial demand, not just from a workforce, but also from a retirement base, it's generally been more than what the market can accommodate and what the existing zoning can allow, whether it's infill or whether it's new, or to use your words, whether it's using what we have already to the best that we can or whether it's creating more. It's going to need to be both. I wish I had a better answer. It's just, I don't think one's better than the other. They just address different issues and they come at it from different ways. So with that, I'm going to pause questions. By the way, this is fantastic. Jason and I's flight is tomorrow morning, so we have all night with you guys. But I want to kind of go through what we've learned through the survey. The first question was, and thank you, sir, for asking for the clarification, was do you support basically applying the set aside to just the bonus units rather than to the entire project? Overwhelmingly, people said yes, which is great, because unfortunately, if you don't, your policy is going to continue to not do a whole lot. The second question was, do you support using tax abatements? Majority of people said yes. That's a tremendous way to infuse or to reduce the cost of development in a manner that commits revenues you're not collecting yet. This is not the revenues you're already collecting off those properties. It's the increment. It's the difference of what you're collecting to what you would have collected to invest back in the property. Third question was funding to get developers. It was split. I'm not terribly surprised because I think the 9 people who said no, I think their question was, well, where's the money coming from? And I respect that and I understand that because the reality is you're either going to have to go get it from somewhere outside, the state, the feds, or you're going to have to get it out of your general fund, which means you're going to have to either reallocate money from something else or you're going to have to generate more. Which approach do you prefer? We gave you a lot of options. I am thrilled. Frankly, the majority response is a combination of all of them. Because this goes back to, sir, the question you just asked indirectly, which is, what's the right approach? And the right approach is all hands on deck. Can we take advantage of funding? Can we take advantage of tax abatements? Can we take advantage of right-sizing our policies so that they are effective? And I think that is the right answer. And I put right in air quotes because right is absolute and my opinion is subjective. But I think if you want to achieve the greatest efficiency and effectiveness of your workforce housing policy, a combination of the two is going to be the best path from that perspective. The fifth question, should the city allow payments into a housing trust instead of delivering units with the intention of funds to create? The answer was yes, which I go back to that partial unit calculation, and I'm happy, maybe not in this room, but if you need more direct explanation of exactly how that is and how that works, I'm happy to do it. But it is also the more fair way of doing it for the development community. If building 12 units makes me give you 2, and building 13 units then makes me give you 3, I'm going to give you 12, and you're going to get 2, because that making me make that new 1 additional unit, an income controlled unit, actually reduces the viability of my project. But if making me give you 12, if I do 12, I give you 2, and if I do 13, I give you 2, and I make you a small payment, I can still make my return and maximize the units that I can deliver. So that's very, very good. Is that all the questions that we had? Is there any questions about, other than the clarification one from you, sir, is there any other questions about what we asked about here, or does anyone want to expand upon their response, or like normal, did I nail it? Okay. Is there any other questions, preferably related to the workforce housing study that we did, that the room wants to ask of us at this point in time? Peter, you want to take us home?
Yeah, I
appreciate everybody turning out tonight, and this will be available online. You can get on our website at the Planning and Sustainability page. And we're always welcome to hear. You're always welcome to give your thoughts and talk with Peter and I, or come to the Housing Committee meeting and give your input. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, everybody. This has been fantastic, and we've thoroughly enjoyed. This has been a tremendous conversation. I really appreciate the thoughtful and topic-specific questions that you all asked. This has been great for us, too. I really enjoy being able to have the back and forth with a community that is informed, engaged, and passionate about a topic. So thank you all so much for being here.